so that means it's time to begin.
We've got about 10 seconds of tape here.
Okay, and the audio tape recorder is all working all right. Okay. My name's Karen Hill. I'm in Moncton, New Brunswick. Today is February 19th, 1984. I'm at the home of Carol Proctor. This is the Oral History of Social Work in Canada project, a project of the Canadian Association of Social Workers. Carol, in order to begin, I wonder if you might tell us when and where you were born and a little bit about your early life.
Well, I was born in Moncton in 1927. And I have lived here all my life and have worked here all my life and gone to schools here, except the years I went away studying social work and my first degree, my BA degree.
Mm-hmm. And in your early family life, where were you during the Depression?
Well, we were living here. My father was in business for himself, and he was a lumber dealer, and I recall very little of it, but I've always heard the family stories about how he had to cash in some of his life insurance policies to pay his employees and keep them going. And I guess in those days a penny looked pretty good. We used to go out and buy a lot of penny candy. We didn't have the kind of allowances that children have today, but I don't have clear recollections much of it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And during the Second World War, you would have been quite a young person during that time as well, weren't you?
Well, I was a young teenager, and Moncton was a very important town as far as the soldiers, the airmen coming over from England to train. It was a manning depot. Sometimes we would have as many as 10 to 20,000 servicemen in the city passing on their way through to other stations. I had two older sisters that dated at that time with the young military people that were going through, but I was young. I was in high school and really was seeing the local people that I was growing up with, but I was quite aware that a war was going on and what was happening. My own boyfriend in high school was in the militia, so that kind of kept me up to date in what was happening.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And after the end of the war, were you what happened then for you?
Well, I graduated from Mount A with a BA in 1948, and and we were still feeling the effects of the war when I was in my undergraduate studies. Halfway through, I believe, my junior year, a lot of the veterans came back, and the campus was loaded with these men that were put on special semester courses to hurry through and finish the education they had started before the war. And then in 1948, I decided to do some further studying after I got my BA, and I went to Halifax to study social work. And there were still signs that the military were coming out. As a matter of fact, the school of social work I attended, the Maritime School of Social Work, I originally heard it had been established in order to give a new career opportunity for people coming out of the services.
Mm-hmm.
Don't know whether that's valid, but it was true. There were former, some of my own classmates were former people that had been in the services during the war. And when they came out, they were in personnel work or something, and they went in to study social work.
Mm-hmm. So when you were at the Maritime School of Social Work then in, what, 48, 49?
48, 49, my first year.
What kinds of courses were you taking?
Oh, we had a wide range of things. We had to study law and the history of social work and casework counseling and information relating to medical problems, and we had courses in public welfare administration, and laws mostly relating to Nova Scotia. Like, we didn't do a lot of studying on the laws of New Brunswick, because I suppose in those days we really didn't know where we'd work after we had graduated.
Mm-hmm.
But we had a very broadly based course and had very good professors, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And we didn't have very fancy quarters. We were quartered in old barrack buildings across from the present VG hospital, so we were living in pretty stringent times with not much money, as I recall.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the veterans that were going were getting something like, what was the the amount of money they gave them for retraining was something around $75 a month or something. So I guess I probably lived on that kind of an amount too. Today it makes you laugh, but we did okay.
Yeah, yeah. Why had you decided on social work?
Well, I knew I wanted to work with people. When I was young in high school and my early years at university, I used to spend my summers at a camp for underprivileged children as a volunteer counselor. We weren't paid for those kind of things in those days, and I really enjoyed it very much. And I got a view on poverty that I had never known, of course, growing up and in the city. And one summer I worked at the Algonquin Hotel as a waitress in a children's dining room. It's a CP hotel in St. Andrews, New Brunswick. And in that dining room I saw another side of life, people that were very well-to-do with their children and all the problems they were having. I guess by the time I graduated from Mount A, I knew I wanted to work with children, and I wanted to work looking at youngsters with problems. So then I heard about the School of Social Work in Halifax and applied kind of at the last minute, and they took me, and I've never regretted it. I've enjoyed every minute of it.
Yes, yeah. At the time that you were at the Maritime School of Social Work, were there faculty or students that were particularly memorable for you?
Well, I guess nobody in my class would ever forget Frances Montgomery, who was the director of the school that year. Frances Montgomery was a graduate of the Pennsylvania School of Social Work, and we used to laugh and joke a lot that she really believed that you only learned through pain. And so we had some pretty dramatic times there, as I recall, and we formed relationships that were very intense then, because you were going through a lot. But
what kind of dramatic incidents occurred that helped you learn?
Well, I personally learned by, at one point, receiving a phone call one day from a friend that was typing a paper for me, and a personal phone call on the business phone. And they wanted me to understand that when I got out in the working world, I couldn't receive personal messages, you see, at work. So they scolded me very firmly, but unfortunately in an old barrack building you could hear everything in the library. So the whole student body heard me being chastised for receiving a personal phone call. They then went on strike and had a big meeting from which I was excluded. And one of the wonderful students that was with us then was Sister Mary Clare from Halifax. She thought the students were being pretty excited. So what she did was she got them all calmed down, and she said she would personally go to the administration and try to explain it wasn't fair because we didn't even have a phone. The phones were hard to get in 48, 49, and so ultimately the school got a payphone. And and I knew that that really didn't have much to do with whether we had a phone or not. It was just making me face a reality in life that work was work, and my work at that time was to be a student, and the administration didn't intend to take personal messages for me. I was just lucky it happened to be a notification that I had a paper for the school being typed, but I could understand it.
Yes, that's certainly one way of learning, isn't it? When you were there, did you do field placements?
Yes, we did, and I had a very interesting field placement. I worked for the Department of Child Welfare in a student unit. Ada Greenhill was my supervisor there. I suppose there were 6 or 7 of us students, and I did everything from adoptions to working with young wards that were under the order of the court, and I really enjoyed it, but I had some creepy feelings. Moncton's a small town, and I went to Halifax, which was quite a big city to me in those days, and when you worked down around the docks and Lower Water Street and the terrible old tenements, it was strange for me, but I learned a lot. Moncton has no broad, or it has now, but in those days, didn't have a broad range of cultural groups. And I learned to mix and understand and be part of several cross-cultural groups that normally I wouldn't have any contact with in this community at that time. So, of course, I've always loved Halifax as a consequence, having been a student there. And the field placement really was quite dynamic, and we worked hard. We had classes 2.5 days a week, and we were in field placement 2.5 days a week.
Was that a one-year course?
No, not really. It was a 2-year course, but after I successfully completed my first year, I decided to marry and came back to Moncton, and they allowed me to do my field placement. Your first year didn't count unless you had, beside the field placement you did all year while you were there, you also had to put in a 6-week block field placement. So they sent me up to New Brunswick, and I did my block placement with the Westmoreland County Children's Aid Society out of Sackville.
And what were you doing there?
Well, again, it was a wide range of Children's Aid Society activities, which is protection of children, and but I think at this, and adoptions and adoption placements, working with unmarried mothers. But one of the other things that affected us at that time was the fact that family allowance had come in, and the Children's Aid Society's got a lot of their referrals from the Family Allowance Department. When children didn't go to school, they would notify us that the children were absent from school and their family allowance would be canceled unless you know, a social worker went in and did an investigation and find out why and see if it was a reasonable excuse for being absent. Now, I don't mean it was like being a school truant officer. In most of those cases, there were pretty serious problems of children not really being allowed to go to school, even if they were motivated to do so. And I think the times had something to do with it. It was a rural area I was working in. And a lot of these people actually were living way out in the woods, and, you know, they had no transportation necessarily. It's not like today with all the wonderful school bus systems. And some parents literally couldn't get their children in. They lived in, you know, shacks way out in the woods, in lumbering woods. And in the winter, their children just had no transportation and couldn't go to school. So I would suggest that people like Tally Morrissey, who was the federal government employee for this province, directing that program, would have, I think, stirred up a great deal of not only referrals for Children's Aid Societies, but as a consequence of the social workers becoming involved, a lot of children got breaks they wouldn't have had otherwise. Because once you confronted a family in not just an angry confrontational way, but when you tried working with those families, they were reasonably cooperative in trying to get their children the opportunity to get to school. And with a little help, some of those things were accomplished. I've had people call me up to 10 years later and tell me what happened to their lives after we managed to, like if they were living in the woods, you know, in a lumbering camp where the mother might be the cook, they would, maybe we could arrange for them to come to town and board near a school. And I've had a young girl one time, even after I'd left the Children's Aid Society, call me at my new place of employment with a mental health clinic here and tell me that she'd grown up, finished her education, and had gone to community college and learned to be a hairdresser, and she was married now, would like me to come visit her. She lived in Shediac. So I guess those early contacts through the Family Allowance Department were pretty valid.
I was interested in what you were saying about the Family Allowance Department being involved so closely with individuals. In my current experience, I get a family allowance check, and there's no person at all anywhere attached to that except me and my daughter.
Yes, I can understand that, but I guess now I think most children go to school. I don't think it was used, family allowance was a big chunk of money to people in those days, and losing that money would make a great deal. If you were a family with 5 or 6 children, families were larger then. So you had a check coming in all year round with family allowance for 5 or 6 children. It was pretty important to keep that check. And I don't suppose anybody would ever admit it, but I think that the Family Allowance Department probably, at least in this area, this is the area that I'm knowledgeable with, they used it kind of as a wedge to facilitate children's attendance at school and that kind of thing. But from those referrals, other things happened. If you came across a family where they literally, that was the only money coming into the home, you might intervene on their behalf with the overseer of the poor. We functioned in those days, by the way, with the overseer of the poor. Welfare wasn't a right in those days. The overseers of the poor in the various counties of the province would grant money to people if they needed it, kind of based on pretty biased feelings. They didn't do it automatically, so I think that was a good program. And maybe people forget that historically that the Family Allowance Department did something pretty positive in the family life problems in New Brunswick, as well as enabling social workers to make a contribution to some of the family problems.
The overseer of the poor, how did that activity or that system work in the Moncton area?
Well, all through New Brunswick, our original legislation for dealing with social services in this province was related to the old Elizabethan Poor Act. And it really wasn't changed until a Liberal government undertook, under Premier Louis Robichaud, undertook a program of equal opportunity. And when he decreed that the counties would no longer collect their own taxes and pay their own way, he decided that the counties would become extinct, I guess, and the province would collect the taxes and pay it out to the regions that needed it the most. But prior to that kind of legislation, we were really in very serious binds. I was young when I came out of the School of Social Work. I seem young now. I was 21, and after only 1 year's training, and going out to see the overseer of the poor, and saying, like, here were 3 children from one family that were seriously neglected, physically abused, in some cases really not even getting enough food to eat, and being able to take those children before the court and make them wards was not based on the fact that children had the need. It was based on the fact whether the overseer of the poor would pay the board. If he refused to pay the board, I literally was, there was no point going to court, because even if I could prove my case in the courtroom and I could get custody of the children, I still would have no money to board them. There was no place to put them. So that the overseer's role was pretty important. And it was kind of interesting, and I guess your ability to get the overseer of the poor to pay you wasn't based on your intelligence, it wasn't based on your knowledge of the family or the need of the family, it was based on your ability to get them to cooperate with you. And you can understand in small rural areas where everybody knew everybody, and it wasn't a matter of confidentiality, because you had to have residency in that county or that parish in order to have, well, each county had a whole group of parishes. Like Westmoreland County might have had 8 parishes, so I would have to deal with the overseer of the poor in that area. And you had to tell him who the person was in order to establish that they had lived there for a year before he would even consider whether he would pay. And a nice old gentleman farmer, and you were trying to get money for 3 illegitimate children from 3 different fathers, and it was very hard for him to say that he would, from his own ethical standards, he would be very critical of that mother and her way of life. And it was very hard to get them to agree. Sometimes, I'd have to wait a week while he thought this all over before he would finally say, yes, I'll give you the court order, give the money order, so that I could have those children. So it's amazing to me now when I see how easy it is. Social assistance is a right in our province now, and people can go if they're in fact in need and get that assistance. So we've come a long way since those days.
Again, during that same period of time, what other organizations would have existed in the Moncton community to serve people with different kinds of needs?
Well, I worked out in the county, but in the city of Moncton, we did have a welfare bureau. And the year I came to work in the Westmoreland County Children's Aid, another social worker there came into Moncton and established a Children's Aid. So in Moncton itself, the only kind of agencies that were clearly identified were the Welfare Bureau, which gave out money and helped people in need, and the Children's Aid Society, and the other groups that you just had to rely on all voluntary groups, like the Catholic Women's League, the St. Vincent de Paul Society of the community, the church groups, and there would be some Red Cross programming done here. The VON didn't come in till sometime later, I think, after 1949. And we just didn't have other agencies. We didn't have support programs to single parents. We didn't have battered women's transition to housing. We didn't have any of those support things. So social workers in those days, you had to be very flexible. There were a lot of things you did that had nothing to do with what you thought was your job. You didn't understand that when you were in the School of Social Work studying community organization. But when I started out, it was just like, it was barren territory. Anything you needed, you created. If there was no association for the retarded, then you got working to try to get an association for the retarded going. And They were pretty exciting times because you used your imagination and you worked a lot with volunteer groups through the churches and so on. And it was a very rewarding kind of experience. But unfortunately, I guess one of the things, I spoke very highly of the Equal Opportunity Program. One of the side effects that was negative of the Equal Opportunity Program was the government took over the departments of health, welfare, justice, and education, as well as the taxation. And the Professional Association of Social Workers at that time, the New Brunswick Association of Social Workers, tried to make briefs to the government and explain that if they took over all these services, the Children's Aid Societies would die. They would be dismantled, and a Department of Social Services running through departmental services would be born. We would lose the natural volunteer element in the community, and in fact that's what happened, what social workers prophesied happened. And the traditional kinds of support groups that were helping people like me in those days disappeared. If I had an unmarried mother that just had no support, and a baby was born, I could go to a church group either in the city or outside the city, and they would give me a layette for that baby so that when it came time to be placed for adoption, I would have something to give away. But that all died off. All that sense of cooperation and help died off, with the exception of some organizations. The St. Vincent de Paul in Moncton has remained very active throughout the years. Like today, they're still active and run low-cost clothing depots and things like that. There are a lot of good volunteer groups just now coming back into the community. The one of our pioneer members of the New Brunswick Association of Social Workers, Florence Christie, I think in a fair way deserves a lot of credit. She became very active in St. John, getting a volunteer bureau going some years ago, and as a result of that, myself, with a very fine community volunteer in Moncton, Thelma Roy, started a volunteer bureau here in Moncton, and then we began to expand that through the province and gave some leadership in other areas of the province. And now we have a big volunteer agency kind of network going in New Brunswick. And so that's been very, very helpful.
That's neat.
So that's good. That's a good move.
Indeed. To go back again to the time when you were just coming, you had come back to St. John and you were working in the field here. You talked about the services that were available. What was the social work community itself like? Who were your colleagues?
Well, there was Grace Reynolds, who was the social worker that was in charge of the Welfare Bureau, and Edna Smith, who was a girl from Albert County, who was also a graduate of the Maritime School of Social Work. And those were the only three in this city. Like, the three of us were the only people who had any, what you'd say, social work training. One had, I think, just taken a course or two at Columbia University in summer semesters. And but in the province, the year before I came, they had established a branch of the Canadian Association of Social Workers. And I think at that time you needed 8 to 10 people. And they just simply couldn't find 8 to 10 trained social workers in New Brunswick. So they amalgamated with PEI. And 2 nuns from PEI, and I believe maybe 1 or 2 other members, became involved with New Brunswick, and we became the New Brunswick PEI branch. And when I joined in '49, there wouldn't be more than 10 people with genuine training or professional education in social work in either of those 2 provinces. So I think we all felt like pioneers those days.
Yeah. How did your early meetings go there when you're spread out over 2 provinces?
Well, it was pretty exciting. We used to meet either in St. John, Fredericton, or Moncton, or once a year we went to PEI. And because, the association was terribly important for us, because, there was no kind of cross-fertilization of ideas and so on, and we had a lot of frustration on the job, and in the community. It was just wonderful to meet together, so we had great motivation to get out and get together. So we'd get a couple of cars and head for St. John or Fredericton, and because we had to do this all in our own time, you never could take time off work. You'd work till 5 o'clock and drive to St. John, and you might have a meeting at 7 o'clock at night that finished at 10 or 10:30, and you turned around, drove back to Moncton, and got home at midnight, and were on the job the first thing the next morning. And my husband used to get quite involved. He used to be our official chauffeur in bad weather. So sometimes when we'd be going to the island, and it'd be in the winter or the spring with icy roads and fog, he'd come along with his car loaded with, they were all ladies pretty well, taking all these ladies over to the island to the meeting. And if his car didn't get through, everybody in the island would be saying, well, if George doesn't get here with his quorum, then there won't be a meeting. And so getting to meetings was a family chore.
Yes.
Sometimes we'd go several cars. When the roads really were bad, we might go 3 cars in a row, and George would lead the way and break the snowdrifts, because even the plowing systems weren't good those days either.
Mhm.
And we knew we had to be back the next day for work, and everybody made it. I remember one time we went to Prince Edward Island, and it was so early in the spring that they even had to open up little cottages for us, like they didn't have motels either over there. So we had these little cottages that had to be opened up, and they were freezing cold, and no restaurants connected with them. We'd have to actually leave here carrying our supper with us, so that when we got there we could feed ourselves, with a thermos of coffee and a cheese sandwich or something.
Yeah.
So we were pretty dedicated. We put a lot of energy
Yeah.
into it.
What were the issues that the association would have worked on at that time? Do you have a recollection about that?
Well, I think that we've always been working on the fact that there were community problems that needed to be dealt with more appropriately, and through family court systems and things like that, and the fact that social assistance was very difficult to get under certain circumstances, and some of the practices and adoptions weren't very pleasing to us. Children, were being given away, and there was some talk in this province of black marketing in babies, that single girls, in fact, that got into difficulties were not brought to the attention of the agencies that were there to protect them and their children, and their decision whether to give up their babies, that sometimes children were actually being given to families to adopt, and money was changing hands, but not to the girl who was having the child. It was the intermediary, whoever it might be. And there were a lot of things that we wanted to see changed in terms of legislation and rights for people. And of course, when the governments of either PEI or New Brunswick would make major changes in their legislation, we would study the new legislation and appear and make briefs before their study committees. We weren't always popular. One thing we used to fight for is we used to feel that if we could get a professional social worker in the departments of welfare as the deputy ministers, then at least you would have a social worker talking to a social worker, because, of course, ministers were never professionals in our fields. Like we always felt that if a lawyer got elected to the House, then he probably would become the Minister of Justice, and if a doctor got elected, he'd become the Minister of Health, and teachers were made Ministers of Education. But there never were social workers. I guess they were too busy, never had time to get involved in politics, so they were never getting elected. So we really believe that the future for our provinces, one of the moves that would be very important would be to have a deputy minister that was a professional social worker. And of course, that was a very unpopular thought. And sometimes...
Why so? Why was it unpopular?
Well, because I guess there were times, I guess we'd be pretty naive if we didn't think that sometimes in those times political appointments were very often made, and when you'd see one of the things we got very severely criticized for, we actually went very publicly to the government and said we didn't want the deputy minister that was appointed. He was probably a nice gentleman, but he was a brigadier, in retirement from the army, and somehow or other the image of a military figure running a social services department, just at that particular point in time with so many social issues at stake, we just felt we had to speak up and say our piece. But needless to say, we weren't terribly popular with that particular deputy minister for his term in government service. I'm sure he did, quite a few things that were pretty positive, but it's very difficult to sit back and see well-intentioned people truly not understand the value system of the social work profession and, your aims and goals in working with people, to strengthen their systems rather than give them handouts and not not set up programs for rehabilitation.
Mhm.
And I suspect even today people don't understand that. I think social workers in the beginning were naive. They would pressure for more monies to be given to people, but what we should have been pressuring for concomitantly with that was that jobs would be provided, training would be provided, and I guess we were expecting the educators to fight for better education and training. But we really should have been fighting right from the beginning so that these generations of welfare families wouldn't exist, where one generation gets on social assistance and they can't seem to shake it because they are now. There's more things happening now, but you know, we're talking about 20 to 30 years ago, and people would get into that system and just simply couldn't get out.
Mhm.
They wouldn't get the education because they didn't have the money to get the education.
Mhm.
So that they had generations of them coming along asking for assistance. And I remember one time in the mental health field, we actually went into one school where there was a lot of poverty, and we assessed children intellectually and physically with the help of the public health nurses. And we found in that school the children who were coming from average income homes were physically bigger. They, in fact, their body structure was bigger because, you know, through generations of mothers not having proper nutrition and children not having proper nutrition, and even in winter not having the proper food coming to school and clothing, we actually, like 3 generations down the road, had a whole group of youngsters that potentially didn't have the same, that they actually didn't have the potential at that point in time to deal with the school system as it was, and they were physically smaller.
Mhm.
And that's not a highly intensively researched thing, but it was exceedingly noticeable. And a lot of those people were on social assistance.
Mhm.
So there were a lot of things that we were seeing, and you know, on your daily job, you don't have time, and you don't have budget to do the research that would help governments release money.
Mhm.
So I don't think social workers were always popular in the things they said when they would. We used to do a lot through the papers and going on radio and trying to help people understand some of the broader issues. But in the beginning, we just thought if we gave people money, things would be better. But we learned you need a lot more than that.
In those days, in the late 40s and early 50s, what role did the Welfare Bureau play?
Well, the Moncton Welfare Bureau would, they'd have a board of, no doubt, prominent business community people, and they would look at some of the social programs in the community that they were concerned about, whether it was children going to school not properly fed or clothed, and they would instruct their worker to try to work with community groups to see what would be needed to help in certain situations and to isolate certain problems that they could deal with. And I suppose they also negotiated with the cities. It seems to me they wouldn't be called an overseer of the poor in the city. I just can't remember. There was a title for the man that was in charge of giving away money here. And they would negotiate actively with city council and so on to get them aware and alert to the fact that social assistance money wasn't being released to the needy groups, to the people that were needed, and that kind of thing.
So, I originally asked that question because I'm wondering about the community action part of the Welfare Bureau, but I'm moved to ask about the relationship between the overseer of the poor, or whoever it was, a relief officer perhaps, in the city that handed out the money. Because I had understood that the welfare bureaus gave out money too.
Not in
No?
the city of Moncton. They could recommend somebody, but you actually, like, even after I left the Children's Aid Society and was working in a mental health clinic, if I came across a family with problems, I would have to send them to the Welfare Bureau, and they investigated and said it was a needy case. That client of mine, who might have had a breakdown or a depression, would actually have to present themselves personally to the Commissioner of the Poor. We had a poor commissioner here, to the Commissioner of the Poor, and, you know, I've had patients come back and tell me, you know, what a degrading experience that was, being questioned and no degree of confidentiality, being questioned openly in an office in, you know, in one of the city-run offices. It was a very, very degrading kind of experience. So the Welfare Bureau in the beginning didn't in fact give out money. They recommended people and they investigated the need or the cases, but their word wasn't the final say. The monies itself came through the city, through the municipality. And at one time, my father was mayor here in the city, and I remember my father saying that, like, when people simply came to the point where they, not just the elderly, but people of all ages, if they had no place to live or stay, they put them in the poorhouse. That poorhouse still exists here in Moncton, but it's now a city garage. It's being used for offices, for other purposes. But in that home, I remember him visiting that home and finding married couples being kept separated, men on one side, women on the other. It was really run like the old Elizabethan poorhouses, just a minimum of food, no rights, no privileges, no confidentiality, no dignity. And my father died about 20 years ago, so it's in the last 20 to 25 years, prior to 20 years ago, that I'm talking about now. So that it really wasn't until equal opportunity came in, I believe it was around 1967, that in fact that system went out.
So there were still poorhouses in New Brunswick until that time.
They may have gotten rid of some poorhouses, but the system was not very good, because we did have some areas of the province that were poor. Like they didn't have a tax base to collect enough money, so they couldn't have as good schools and they couldn't have as good social assistance aid. Like the rates in that area would be entirely different than they would be in another rural area, a good rich farming area with a good tax base. People there might get more money given to them for rent and for food than in a poorer area. But then when the province took all the tax payments to themselves and on some complex system, they sent the money back into the regions. And there was some degree of equality there.
Going back then, when we left off on your career, you were doing your field placement as you'd come back to Moncton. What was your first job after that?
I stayed on with the Children's Aid Society. The girl that had been there ahead of me had moved into the Children's Aid in Moncton and Albert County, and I stayed with the Western County Children's Aid for 3 years. And there were a lot of kind of primitive things. My husband and I were laughing the other day, talking about my wonderful salary. They only could afford me 2/3 time. In other words, on a 6-day week. They wanted 4 days of my time, and for that,
6-day week.
It was a 6-day week. Oh yes, we worked 6 days in those days, all day Saturday as well. I forget. I don't feel that old, but I guess I clearly remember that it was a 6-day week. They were only paying me for 2/3 of that time. They were paying me $100 a month to work 4 days a week. But like anybody that's ever worked with children know that if somebody called me on Saturday night, I actually have come home with my husband, say after being with friends in the evening, at midnight and getting a call from the city police saying, in my area, just outside the city, there was a report that children had been left alone for 3 days. It's midnight, and so what do? Well, you get in your car, and my poor old husband, who was a great volunteer, I'd say, you'll have to drive the car, because if I'm going to apprehend 3 children, we had no holding houses, because nobody would pay board rates to hold beds for anybody. So here I would be with 3 children, no mother, and maybe I couldn't find her. So we'd go, and he would wait in the car, and I'd go in, and sure enough, there'd be 3 children, filthy, dirty, no food, fires out, and I would have to go wake up neighbors and ask them where the mother was. Well, she was an alcoholic. She disappeared 3 days ago. Where were the nearest relatives? No father, no anybody I could contact. And I remember that night a neighbor told me of a friend of the mother's, and we took the children in the car, which I was allowed to do under the Children's Protection Act. I could apprehend children, and where they were neglected. I took them in our car, and they were so dirty. The children were in ages about 2 to 5, 3 of them. Filthy dirty, soiled, and driving freezing cold night with your windows all open because that was practical, and going to another home out in Lakeburn and knocking on a strange door and asking that woman if she'd take in her friend's children for the night. Very primitive, like no no real system. But that wonderful woman doing that for me and taking those youngsters and cleaning them up. So the next morning when I came back and could arrange for a home, you know, I would have spent some more hours that night contacting foster parents that were potential and would find where that woman's residence was, her place of settlement, and then I would get to the overseer of the poor who would agree, and by the next day I could move those children into an appropriate place.
Mm-hmm.
So I learned, having come from a student in Halifax in a very well-run child welfare department, and the deputy minister there, by the way, was Fred McKinnon, who was a professional social worker. And I suppose that's why, you know, a lot of us seeing Nova Scotia as a model, that would be a good way to go, having a deputy minister that was a professional. But we would, you know, at that time, come back and be able to develop special programs for kids on the spur of the moment. But I think we've come a long way, and but I had a great shock. Like, I was a city girl, small city. Moncton wasn't big, about 30,000 no doubt then, and I suppose it's 60,000 in the environment, you know, in the greater area now. But at that time, when to go out, like, I knew what a slum in Africville in Halifax and on Lower Water Street was like. I didn't realize that in rural areas there were slums. I thought even if you did have a tar paper type of shacky house that, you know, there were always means of getting water and it would be a nice clean place. I was pretty shocked to go into rural New Brunswick and find no water, one-room shacks with maybe a table, one chair, a wood stove, no amenities, no sofas, well, maybe 2 double beds in the one room. And, you know, chickens running in and out the back shed, and really pretty sad state of affairs. But I had some fun times, too. Sometimes on Saturdays, my husband would go with me. He worked for CN in Moncton, and on Saturday afternoon he'd drive the car for me. And I've been to places where I've gone to investigate battering of children, and had the man of the house, of course, deny it and chase me out of the house and stand at the front door shouting at me and waving a stick of firewood at me, and my husband sitting in the car. And one time my mother said, well, what would you have done, George, if he really had hit your wife? And he said, I'd have run, because he had more firewood at hand than me. But we used to get them out. The RCMP would go in with us when, in advance, we knew that we were going to be in for a rough time. Mm-hmm. But it was tough. The roads were bad. I've been caught at night crossing through the Albert County. Albert County was a wonderful county for boarding children. And although I worked in Westmoreland, I very much found it very, very much easier to find foster homes in Albert County. And I found myself at midnight crossing through these little dark dirt roads all by myself and be confronted with 2 moose sitting there looking at me. Mm-hmm. And, you know, you turn out your headlights and you just pray, you know, they're going to change their mind, go somewhere else, mm-hmm. and be really caught, you know, up to a half an hour in a little dirt road. And we were pioneers, I think, mm-hmm. In those days. And it's not just me. The other social workers had some of the same experiences. I know this area where there were 3 workers, but I'm sure people in other areas of New Brunswick had similar things. Mm-hmm. One of the things that was difficult in those days were many of the children's aid societies were staffed by very unprofessional as well as non-professional people. Unprofessional meaning people that were do-gooders and thought that's all you needed to work with people. And there were some pretty horrendous stories in the early days of the quality of some of the staffing that was going on in the agencies. So no doubt the New Brunswick Association would go to government and make representation that we felt, we were prejudiced, but we really felt that life experience alone doesn't prepare you for helping people. Like, it's not a question of giving things to people, it's helping them rehabilitate themselves. Mm-hmm. And there's quite an art in that. Mm-hmm. And in those days, most social work was actually done on the run. You didn't do it in an office. In the cities, people would come to your office. But my early days in Children's Aid Society work, I didn't have an office. I worked out of my own home, out of my own apartment in those days. And so, you know, you conducted your interviews in leaning over a fence in the back field of a farmer's yard, or sitting in the kitchen with all the children running around talking to you, and you didn't do the so-called fancy counseling and therapies that we do now. It's quite different.
Children's aid societies today are in some places criticized for inadequate investigation, inadequate record keeping, failure to keep track of where kids have been placed and things like that. I understand that that New Brunswick was a subject of criticism on those same types of accounts for decades.
Yeah, I'm sure that happened. Like, you know, it's probably not nice to admit at this point, but, you know, for me to get my records typed, it was a major, like I had to keep records here with me in my apartment, and when I'd go for supervision to Sackville, to my supervisor, who would be, my supervisor was an unpaid professional social worker who was executive secretary of the Children's Aid, I would have to take my notes there, and they had to be very briefly written because they had volunteer typists. You know, toward the end of my time working for the Children's Aid, they paid a neighbor of hers a little money to do the typing, but like you didn't have records. If I had dropped dead at that time, it would be kind of hard. Like I wouldn't have a list of all the foster homes I knew. They were up here in my head, and you just didn't have time. I guess I started to tell you a little while ago, it was a joke that they were paying me for 4 days each week, but I actually worked 6 days a week, and you just worked all the time. And when you think the kinds of mileage you're dealing with, when you're on the road, you're on the road. And the roads were, in those days, not all as good as they are today.
What kind of geographic area would you have been covering then in your
Well,
your
the Westmoreland County Children's Aid, Westmoreland County runs all the way from Cape Tormentine in the east, which is where you would take the ferry to PEI, and it goes past the city of Moncton going west to Petitcodiac. And I guess it's, you're covering about 100 miles or more just in that. It's a long, narrow kind of county.
Again, to try and help me outline the parameters of what child welfare was like then, how did Children's Aid Societies get their funding?
Well, that was exciting. I didn't know how they got their money when they hired me, but I found out to my sorrow very shortly afterwards that they collected it. And they would have a community board appointed, and this community board, fortunately for the Westmoreland County Children's Aid, consisted of very fine people, but very well-to-do business people, and they served on the board and they gave money, but also I was required to go out and make speeches, which nobody had ever warned me about when I was hired. And one of the first jobs I did after I was hired, I had to go to Petitcodiac and speak to the Kiwanis Club. And I was literally so scared. You know, here I was going to get up and make a sales pitch about why they should give us a donation of money. And I was actually begging for money for me because, like, it literally would be going toward my salary and my car expenses. And it was quite a shock to me to understand that in the process of everything else I did, I was having to sell the agency to the community, not just because of its helping nature, but financially. And I doubt if the province gave grants. There might have been very small ones as the years went on. At the time they were disbanded, the government perhaps had gotten more involved. But church groups, maybe each parish gave a little bit, because I can remember my supervisor was Dorothy Bishop, and she was a grand old lady already retired from social work in the United States that moved to Canada. And she was a functional social worker from her early training. And I don't know if you ever heard the discussions, the difference between functional. Well, when I was studying social work the first year, there was a lot of arguments and laughs about the two schools of social work, one being functional and one being diagnostic. And an example of a diagnostic school of social work would be Smith College, that's based on the Freudian understanding of what makes people tick, why do they do the behaviors that they do. and you intervene at that level, working with them in an insightful way. The functional school of social work tended to teach that when you came across a problem with a family, any means that you had to use or your client had to use to solve the problem was valid. So I remember one time being invited to my supervisor's home for dinner, and she had served a beautiful wild duck dinner to the overseers of the poor. And, you know, like I was young and I knew when I was being supervised by her, she had some very critical views on the attitudes of overseers of the poor, and she was so charming with these gentlemen, serving them cigars and everything after dinner. I really couldn't believe my eyes. And so I asked her, you know, after the men were gone, I said, how come you were so charming to these people that really don't understand what the Children's Aid Society does? And she said, we need their support, we need their money. And she says, you know, you're going to get more flies with honey. So, and that's the functional, you know. Mm-hmm. It's not really the end, the means justifies the ends. But sometimes you have to smile when you don't feel like it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that was my introduction, I thought, to functional social work.
Yes, yeah, that's interesting. During the time that you were at the Children's Aid Society, how did things change over those few years?
Within the Children's Aid?
Within and for the work that you were doing, were there significant developments in the community too, or did things stay the same?
Probably not in those 3 years I was specifically with the Children's Aid, but I think by the time the program of equal opportunity came in, there were a lot of changes. I think monies came more easily. There was more money coming in the community, like, you know, after the war. A lot of money had been generated during the war and after the war, and I think that things in the 50s began to get a little more comfortable with the Children's Aid societies and their budget. People began to look outward more, like the systems of communication got bigger and broader and brighter, so that people knew what people needed more. Like, the only people that would know in those early days what was needed for some of my clients would be their immediate neighbors. Nobody else knew. But as you began to get newspapers being more interested in social factors and the well-being of people, and when you had professional associations making statements to the press and having articles written, and when the Children's Aid Societies themselves released reports, the community got more educated about the broad needs of people. And I guess I wouldn't say they went downhill. I felt, of course, I made a contribution, and whether I did or not, I don't know. But you always feel that I really felt those years were very powerful, engaging years. It really, I think any social worker starting out, probably a very, very good learning experience for them would be to work either in a Children's Aid Society or a Department of Child Welfare. And that's where you really see life like it is. There's no pretense, it's real. And when you begin to intervene at the community level, trying to organize programs and get communities to answer some of their own needs and problems, there's a great deal of satisfaction in that. And I guess I just can't think of a very good answer to the specific question you asked.
Perhaps as the last question in this section, I'll just ask a very specific one then. In some parts of the country, electrification, roads improved dramatically during the early 50s, and radio became available. Telephones became more available.
Right. Yeah.
People became more able to communicate.
Yes.
And social workers were able to get their message across too.
Yes. Yes, I'm sure that's true.
Was that the period during which that was happening here?
Yes, I would say so. The people were very isolated, and families helped one another a great deal at that time. Or ignored, like if there was a black sheep in the family and his family were starving, sometimes families, they went one way or the other. They either helped or ignored. And and with the advent of those changes with telephones and so on and better road systems, I think a lot of the social problems changed. They became a little different. Like in the years, like 35 years ago when I started in social work, I dealt with a lot of very prime poverty, real, genuine poverty. Even now, people who are unemployed and have no money per se may still be running a car, and they may still have a TV, and there may be some food on the table, but the food costs more and so on. But I actually went into homes where what they were eating, maybe months at a time, were things like turnip soup, you know, and that's not turnip soup with meat in it. That's just plain turnips boiling. I literally would come out of homes with my clothes smelling like turnips or cabbage, because those were vegetables they could grow and would keep through the winter. And really, there was really serious problems of that nature. Now, I guess social workers are interested in improving systems, improving counseling systems, and so on. But I think we've come a long way, but I guess we still have a long way to go.
Well, maybe we can take a break there.
Okay.
Okay.
Break time. So what would anybody like at break time? A cup of tea, cup of coffee, a cup of orange juice?
We're resuming our discussion today with Carol Proctor in Moncton. Carol, when we broke, we were discussing your work at the Children's Aid Society. When did you leave there, and where did you go then?
Well, I stayed home for a brief period of time. I had had an illness that I had contracted working out in the cold and all kinds of weather. And I stayed home for a short period of time, a couple of months, resting and getting rejuvenated for another kind of challenge. And I was offered employment as the first social worker to be hired in a mental health clinic in New Brunswick. And I guess I was a little hesitant because I thought I had no special expertise or psychiatric training, although I had taken a year's course in my original social work training in psychiatry. You know, I just wondered whether you needed some extra skills and so on. But however, I did go to work in 1952 in February at the Moncton Mental Health Clinic, and I was the first social worker hired in one of these clinics. And that was kind of a pioneer job too, because with the help of the National Department of Health and Welfare, who did have a mental health division in those days, the provinces were getting into developing programs in mental health that they had never had before. And although we had a mental hospital in New Brunswick, we were just starting this new division, and 3 clinics opened up in New Brunswick, in Moncton, St. John, and Fredericton. And there was nothing to fall back on, although there was a social work consultant in the Fredericton head office. So anyway, I jumped into a new field, and off we went. And I guess if you remember, in 1952, the tranquilizing drugs really hadn't been discovered then, and were not in wide use. They were used in some instances, probably for research purposes during that time. But I remember, after going into the mental health field, that the things like Serpicil and Largactil coming on the market for the first time. So, but I guess probably that even came after 1952. But in the early stages, we didn't even have in our clinic full-time psychiatrists. At the very beginning, we had a psychologist and myself and a secretary. And then later, a Moncton girl who was a graduate of the Dal Medical School and had gone on and studied psychiatry came to work as the first clinical director. And it was pretty exciting times. Well, it was kind of interesting in one way. There was a lot of stigma attached to mental health programs. And a community like Moncton had never seen or had anything to do with psychiatrists before. And people didn't want to come to the clinic, like they felt stigmatized by coming. So in the early days, we were practically out there not hauling people in off the street. But we, again, were into public education to try to help people understand the value of getting psychiatric help early for themselves and their family. So we had lots of dynamic things happening. We started I was a charter member of the formation of the first Canadian Mental Health Association branch in Moncton, around that time, possibly 1953. And our mental hospital in St. John had, it was the first mental hospital, I believe, built in Canada. You know, it seems to me it must have been built around 1848 with the famous old social worker, so-called, Dorothy Dix, coming from the United States to give consultation on it. And I can't remember how many patients it was built for, but they had doubled the population. There were times when there actually were 2,000 people in that institution. And up until I went into the mental health field, it was thought that when people went to the mental hospital, that was the end of them. They never came out. They just stayed there until they died, that mental illness was not curable or treatable, and people, when their families went in there, just pretty well said goodbye to their relatives. They just really thought they would never have them home again. So with the advent of people like me as a social worker in a clinic, and they hired Stan Matheson as a social worker in the hospital, and our job was to try to help rehabilitate people and get them back to the community. And I had the very exhilarating experience, but frustrating at that time, of bringing out the first mental patient from a mental hospital in New Brunswick. And Stan Matheson, as the social worker there, had worked with some of the doctors, and they had chosen this patient who had been in there during 2 world wars, and his family had forgotten him. As a matter of fact, they were Acadians that had emigrated to Boston, and his relatives, I had to go visit the relatives and ask them if they'd bring him home, and they really just couldn't conceive of it, because nobody had ever been asked, really, to bring somebody out. And ultimately, the family just said no, they just couldn't. His own parents, I think, might have taken him to Boston, but we have those strict immigration laws. You can't get into the United States if you've had mental illness. So I lived out in the community around the Magnetic Hill Inn, and the lady who ran that inn agreed to take him there to live and to work in their tourist attraction. And he came out and spent the rest of his life there, never had to be readmitted to hospital, never had a big breakdown, and in fact, really wasn't even treated by our clinic. Ultimately, within 6 months to a year, he really, other than the traumatic shock, the cultural shock of coming out to the community, he didn't need any help. I was the only one that ever saw him. Our psychiatrist never saw him. He'd gone into the hospital at the age of 18 with some kind of an upset, and he just simply got forgotten, left there. And when he came back to the community, he just stayed there within that family, and he learned many trades while in the mental hospital, from watchmaking to being a carpenter. And that was a great advantage in the Magnetic Hill gift shop, and I guess those people that took him, they were pioneers too. Yeah, they deserve a lot of credit too for being able to reach out to an absolute stranger and give him employment and a home the rest of his life. So that was pretty exciting for me. And there were less exciting things that happened, like one time a 13-year-old boy had been placed in the mental hospital from Moncton because he had been sent to the basement because he was a heavy bedwetter, and his father had it, and he was accustomed to beating this boy, and he'd sent him to the basement and said he was going to beat him. And when the father came down, the boy was hysterical and attacked the father and said, like, you beat me once more, I'll kill you, type of thing. He didn't have the means. He was only 13, and he would never have killed his father, but it was a pretty frightening experience. So he ended up in our mental hospital, and later it was possible for us to get him out and help him be rehabilitated, and really set up a relationship with his father as well. So those were pretty interesting times. It's hard for me to believe now that children were admitted to that mental hospital. They had no special facilities for dealing with emotionally disturbed children, and it certainly wasn't the place for children to be. But where we couldn't find solutions by going straight to the point, we developed new resources in the community, because Moncton still didn't have a lot of agencies then.
And you mentioned that you were involved with the development of the Canadian Mental Health Association. Did other resources develop over time?
Yes, one of the things that we discovered, of course, when the clinic opened, a lot of children were referred to us for intellectual assessment, and we found there was a large core group of mentally retarded people in the community, both children and adults, that were being hidden away in people's homes. Again, it was a stigma to have that kind of problem in your family. And with a lot of public advertising and talks and meeting with groups and so on, ultimately we were able to have some children come that were assessed, and from this we were able to form a self-help group Actually, in Moncton, they formed an association called the Mentally Retarded and Cerebral Palsied Association, because there had been some error in the early days of people thinking that cerebral palsied children, because they were spastic and unable to be very mobile or to communicate because they didn't have well-developed language, were retarded. And although we screened those cases and clearly told the parents the difference, they opted to kind of stay together and help one another, and they've stayed together as a branch in Moncton with both groups still involved, which is kind of interesting. But the rest of the province later formed a Canadian Association for the Mentally Retarded, and there's no other branch that's the mixed group. But so through the years, we've been instrumental in trying to help certain troubled groups start associations and things of that nature. There's a lot of other organizations in Moncton now. There's the at one point, we helped organize a learning disability association to assist parents and their children with learning disabilities. And as a matter of fact, we even instituted a program for learning disabled children. And we did that by working closely with the community, by getting the premises of the YMCA and getting small grants from various groups in town to buy the equipment that we needed. We ran a demonstration clinic for 2 years. Then ultimately, the school system recognized it as an educational problem, not as a mental health problem. And now they pretty well assume responsibility for helping children like that. So that, and we have a hearing handicapped association now as a result of some of the things that went on in the clinic. One year we had 3 or 4 preschool deaf children referred to us, and the parents didn't want to send them away to the school for the deaf in Halifax and separate them from the families. So we helped them form a parents association for the hearing handicap, and within 4 months we were able to negotiate with the provincial government and the department in Nova Scotia that also shared the facility in Halifax for the deaf. And a teacher was sent here, and she lived here, and we started our own classroom for the hearing handicapped preschool children. Many of them have never had to leave home. They've been taught to talk with the most modern of equipment. And I believe Moncton now has 2 classes for hearing handicapped children. And like, in a way, that doesn't seem like a mental health problem, and why were we concerned about facilitating the development of that? But it's because you know, when you have a mentally retarded child at home and you know in your heart they could learn more and do more, you really, it becomes a mental health problem. It becomes a worry to the family, and it affects other family members. But now we have very active programs here for the mentally retarded. I worked very actively trying to get an adult services workshop going and served on that board for many years. And during Centennial year, when the Kennedy Foundation gave grants of money to every province, I worked with the association again and worked on committees starting community residences, and at one point we even started to volunteer our own services working at night, taking over the YMCA on Sunday night to run recreation physical education programs for the retarded, simply because, again, these young people needed something to do, like other kids do.
Moncton has a large proportion of Francophone people. What kinds of services were available for Francophones in the early days, and how has that developed?
Well, in the mental health services, the government has a commitment to provide bilingual services, and it would be the same in the Department of Child Welfare. The Moncton would have a large percentage of their professional staff that have 2 languages. And people could have a choice of what kind of language they wanted their therapy conducted in, and the records of clients are kept in the language that the therapy is done in. But in the early days that wasn't so. In the early days of the clinic developing and some of the other services developing, there wasn't that provision. And there were problems. I remember being as an English-speaking social worker, having difficulties when people came into the city, because the mental health clinic was here, and having to try to communicate and recognizing I was having difficulty, then we would get another staff member to come in and either do the interview or do interpretations. It's never the same as doing it in your own language. But our mental health clinic today, you know, the original staff went from 4 people. We have 30 people in our mental health regional clinic now. It services 3 counties. And I suspect that of the 30 staff members, at least 25 are bilingual. So there's no problems that way now. But we have gone through tough times.
What about, and this is nothing that you would necessarily have any knowledge of, I suppose, but what about the big hospital that was at St. John?
Well, that it was recognized that that hospital was not staffed by French-speaking people, and St. John at that time was primarily an English-speaking community. So what the province did around, I would say somewhere around 1960, they opened another hospital, mental hospital in the northern part of the province in Hamilton, New Brunswick, and it was recognized that it was necessary to try to establish a hospital where the therapists and the staff members would be French-speaking. Now, in the beginning, that was very difficult to get because they didn't originally have a lot of French-speaking people that were available, like doctors and so on. They were bringing, like psychiatrists, for instance, and they were bringing them from outside the province. But eventually, through the University of Moncton and its growth and development, there's a School of Nursing with psychiatric training, and there's a School of Social Work, and there's a School of Psychology. But getting French language psychiatrists was a problem. So in the beginning, there were a lot of complaints from the North Shore that a lot of the work was still done there in English, and it was very difficult for patients going in there too for a while. But I suspect that, you know, in these times, things have evened out better. As a matter of fact, recently they've hired 5 psychiatrists from Quebec province, and they're very well staffed at the moment, and so language is no problem there at the moment.
Another issue that I believe was current over those years from 1960 on or so was the idea of deinstitutionalization, closing or cutting down the population of the large institutions. You mentioned that you brought the first client out of the hospital into the community. Was that followed by more?
It was followed by more, but in 1970, I was acting regional director of mental health, and to my chagrin one day, I woke up in the morning and found out we had about 100 or 150 decertified, deinstitutionalized mental patients that had been brought into this region. And like, we were just stunned. We didn't have psychiatric staff to follow them, and although technically they were decertified as not needing to live in a mental hospital, no individualized preparation had been made from them. Like in the years between 52 and through the 60s, there was, like, any person coming out wherever possible, you tried to make a genuine rehabilitation plan with them and their family, and it was done on a case-by-case basis. But to wake up some morning, and outside the city about 25 miles, there's a TB hospital. At that time, TB was on the wane, and they were closing that hospital. They brought 2 or 3 busloads of those patients and put them in that TB hospital, and without any addition to our regional staff to help. And very shortly after that, while we were busy making a protest provincially about that, locally, and all the agencies getting pretty excited and upset, they brought 2 busloads to Bucktouche. There was a big convent there that was sold, and a private business lady that wanted to open a nursing home or something of that nature ended up one day with 2 busloads of mental patients coming there. And again, it was very shocking to the people, like, you know, public health nurses, local, well, in Bucktouche at that time, there weren't very many agencies. As a matter of fact, their social services department was in Richiboucto, and it was a big shock. And I don't think the community knew. Like, nobody in the community really realized what was happening. And Kent County is primarily a French-speaking community, and into this big old convent came just anybody. They didn't choose people from this area. They just took 2 busloads of people that had been told they were going to be moved out of hospital. And it took a long time to kind of clear up that mess. And the nursing home operators, they weren't used to mental patients. They didn't know what to expect of them. They didn't have special expertise. Their staff didn't, and it was quite a shock. But they were well fed and clothed and that kind of thing. But they had no recreation programs going in the beginning. It was pretty tough. And now, of course, as you know, there's another big move to deinstitutionalize the central care. Central care went from that, 30 years ago, approximately 1,800 to 2,000 patients. They're down to 400 now, and if not lower. And they are now going to bring some more patients out, but a lot more programming is being done. Some of the budget of that hospital has been transferred to the community, and they're bringing out, about 150, 160 patients, which will be taken to their original area, whether they're retarded or whether they're psychogeriatric, the elderly patients, or whether they're just general psychiatric patients. And some of Centricare's budget is being released to the various mental health regions to provide, group homes or private living or recreation programs, activities for them. So they're trying to do this time a better program, because it's been a catch-up game. It's taken 10 to 12 years to help those people that were dumped out originally.
Yeah.
And,
Was the training that you had at Maritime School of Social Work in 48, 49, how did that serve you during the years that you were working at the mental health clinic?
Well, I believe I happen to have a feeling that social work should be kind of a generic program in training. And I guess I really did get good training that first year, because all those psychiatric lectures I had from have you ever heard of Dr. R.O. Jones? He's probably the father of psychiatry in the Maritime provinces and is the chief of psychiatry, or was, for many years at the Dalhousie Medical School. And last year, I believe, was the president of the Canadian Psychiatric Association. Dr. Jones had been my lecturer that first year, and it was amazing. I still had all that information in notes and even in my head. And that first year, that 1 year, did help me a great deal when I did go into the mental health field. And I guess your generalized skills come to you, and social workers should be able to adapt, whether they work in a family court or a child welfare department or a psychiatric setting. But you have to upgrade yourself. I had to do a great deal of I had to be upgraded. As a matter of fact, I remember this experience with mixed feelings. The first psychiatrist to come to Moncton was Dr. Bursey, and she persuaded me to go to the hospital when she was working with patients in the outpatient department, where she was then treating patients. She would persuade me to come in and actually help hold down patients that were having shock treatments. And and I guess now that I think about it, like what she was saying is, how can you help patients understand what's happening if they're having a shock treatment, or help the relatives understand if you haven't even seen one yourself? So I was exposed to some interesting situations, and we went to the mental hospital at Centricare, where the division had a very aggressive, helpful in-service training program. They brought in some of the best psychiatrists and trained people on a regular basis every month, and all the clinics went to Centricare each month for upgrading and training. And while I was there, I learned a fair amount.
You later went back to school.
Yes, in 1959, they were increasing staff, and I had been in the mental health clinic for 8 years, and the director of mental health suggested that it might be a good idea if I finished my master's degree then. So I went back to the Maritime School of Social Work 10 years later, and it was a fascinating year, very hard, because I'd been out there working for 10 years, and everything I read I wanted to know more about, whether it was in psychiatry or juvenile delinquency or whatever it was. So I'd go to the library to do a project on one thing and end up reading myself crazy on another subject. But and then again, I took psychiatry again from Dr. Jones, which was very helpful. And I guess through the years, and then finally I wrote my thesis and got my master's degree granted, and came back to the clinic. And ever since, it hasn't been a one-woman social work department. We now have 7 social workers in the clinic.
Mm-hmm.
So with the trend toward community psychiatry and working with patients in the community, it's been necessary to increase staffing. And, and I guess like most facilities, we'd like more staff even now.
Mm-hmm. Working in the field of mental health over that number of years, one particular thing that I've wondered about is the development of preventive services. Was that an issue during the early years, and what happened later on about that issue?
Well, sometimes in the early years, we tried to do some preventive programming, and it probably worked, but there was no formal research. Like, we did a lot of work going into schools, working with specific kinds of problems. We often did consultations in communities, like when kids started being bused to schools in the city. One of the problems that came to light was the students that had been used to going to a rural setting and walking to school within their own region suddenly were in town for the day with their noon hours. And one school in particular was close to a shopping mall. And all these youngsters that were bussed in and left there for the day would go to the mall, and of course the incidents of shoplifting and just general rowdyism and inconvenience to the shopkeepers in that mall increased. So they would come to the clinic, and rather than having them select 10 troublemakers and refer them to the clinic, it was better for one of our staff to go meet with a committee of some of the shopkeepers and the school authorities and the parents, the Home and School Association, and we were able to go and negotiate for a local boys club to invite the country children that normally carried the lunch, and the city children didn't. And they were invited to go to that place at noon hours and bring their lunches and have recreation programs run. That soon faded away. It was just an initial problem that came up with the rural area children being bussed in. They were no worse than the city kids that were out other places, probably shoplifting too. But it kind of pulled the community together, and it was kind of preventive in a sense of, that major problems didn't arise. And every now and again we would get that kind of a community problem that we'd work with. In some cases, there was a serious problem in one rural community where there had been some serious sexual activities carried on at a school ground, and the clinic went down and gave a series of sex education programs to the teachers and to the parents of that Home and School Association to help them decide how they were going to deal with it right there in the community. So they're preventive, but they weren't researched, is to know, like, what did we really in the end prevent? We knew we overcame some specific crises and problems, but prevention is even more in the wind these days. They're talking about it more and more, like, although we give a very direct service, we do a lot now in secondary prevention and tertiary prevention. And but they're now talking more and more that we have to get back to the preventive aspects.
Another question about that period of time in your life from, 1953 on that you started in the mental health field. How has the issue of unionization of social service workers affected you and your job?
Well, I don't happen to be unionized through some unfortunate circumstance, probably, because the regional, like my work title is Coordinator of Community Services in Mental Health Region 1. I'm a regional coordinator of community services, and those people were excluded from the union. And the other senior staff in clinics, like the senior psychologist and senior nurse, are unionized. But I believe since this equal opportunity program came in, when all the professional social workers became part of government service, they also became unionized at that point. And I feel that it's been difficult, even though I'm not a union person, you understand, I think it's been difficult for social workers to object to anything in government service, whether it's through their union or whether it's through their employer. Because, like, you can't go to a paper and give an interview about some situation that you aren't agreeing with, because the same day, what you're really doing is you're being non-complimentary to your employer, which is in fact the government. There's only very few social workers in this province employed privately in private agencies. Equal opportunity meant it really took out of the hands of the people the running of their own agencies. And there's now a little swing back to it. Like we have an agency in New Brunswick called Family Enrichment and Counseling Services, and for years and years they were, along with the Family Welfare Bureau in St. John, about the only private agency. And they were the only people, their staff, their social workers were about the only people that come out publicly and say something that was negative, or you can say things in a positive way that are negative, could be interpreted in a negative way by your employer. So although the workers are unionized and they have good working conditions and that kind of thing, I believe that many of our departmental people are overworked. And so there needs to be some adjustment in that, either a change in role description. I don't mean you have to go out and hire 100 more social workers, but I think you need to look carefully at what the priorities are.
Has that caused difficulties, this lack of differentiation, has that caused difficulty for the New Brunswick Association of Social Workers, for example?
Well, yes, the New Brunswick Association, tries to keep a watching brief on what's going on in the field of social welfare and social services. And you'll find that at a meeting where some very strong statement has to be made, the association is looking to the professors at the schools of social work to make the statement, or workers in the private sector, or maybe workers who just at that moment aren't employed. And that's not appropriate either. I don't think that's really the way to handle it. That's kind of running around through the back door. But the government now the Department of Social Services is in fact sponsoring a lot more the growth of private agencies. There are grants to transition homes for battered women, programs where men are being worked with who are battering women and abusing their children and this kind of thing. There are grants to single parents, there's grants to volunteer bureaus, to Head Start programs. So in a way, by giving in grants, they're financially assisting them. But they're pretty receptive to letting those agencies answer back. Even though just at the moment, professional social workers directly employed by the system have to go through the association to sometimes be heard. There are other ways, I guess, of getting around it now. It's a little bit better.
You've been active as well with at the national level of the Association of Social Work. How did you happen to get involved with the national level?
Well, many years, all branches, many years ago, the way the Professional Association was set up in Canada, branches were allowed to send so many representatives to the national board. And the New Brunswick quota, being a small association, sent one. And so I was elected and nominated one year to go as the branch representative. And at that first year, I was elected as well to the executive committee of the national board. And I remained with the national board 8 years, and they were pretty exciting years. There were a lot of social welfare issues coming up in Canada. There was a lot of problems resulting in formation of unions, like it was thought the social workers were such do-gooders, they shouldn't belong to unions. And there were a lot of pretty national, exciting things happening and pretty important issues. So while I was with the national board, there was a lot of work to do, and we were serving on committees and preparing briefs, and for a number of years I was the national membership chairman and was vice president at one time, and those were pretty exciting kinds of years. But
what were some of the issues that you remember most clearly?
Well, I can remember that one of the major crises that we faced at one time was the issue in British Columbia of some quarrel having to do with union membership and the unions, and social workers becoming unionized and feeling that some of the individual rights were being lost through that process. And when they were trying to speak up against this kind of, they just weren't used to this this strong union movement. And when they would try to speak up on issues, like in fact at meetings they weren't allowed to speak, and at one time there had been an implied threat that when the United Way campaigns were on, that some very dirty publicity would come out about social workers being against unions, because all the social workers, the professional social workers, were not joining, because they were members of the British Columbia Association of Social Workers. And I think at that time two professional associations got going at once, and there were a lot of pros and cons happening at that time, but I think a lot of those issues settled down as the profession matured and as the unions began to understand what was going on. And I guess looking at what history has taught us with the recent layoff of those hundreds of social workers in British Columbia, that it was there were some positives about having union involvement. And I think that they all worked together very well, all the professional social workers in the unions during that crisis.
What about the issue of credentials and membership in the professional association?
Well, I remember that. I probably gained a few of my gray hairs through that. I probably was national membership chairman then. And that was the issue about whether the new BSW program was equal to the MSW program. And there was a strong feeling within the association that BSW graduates should not be admitted to membership unless it was at an associate level. They wouldn't be voted in, they wouldn't join as full voting members of the association. And there was a strong feeling that as the BSW degree became stronger and better known and with more content that the professional association could recognize, and by working together it was felt that it was important to admit the BSWs, that it was the first professional degree, and that ultimately changes would come about in the master's degree, and that would accept that kind of recognition. And ultimately that's what did happen. We had many, many votes across the country and many anguished moments wondering what to do. And I guess it's partly because when the universities were starting the new BSW degree, like any new program starting, there was a lot of suspicion. And how were you going to use those people? Were they like case aides, or were they in fact real genuine professionals committed to the same principles and concepts of social work training and practice? And I think as the universities strengthened their programming and so on, and of course the Canadian Association of Schools of Social Work keeps a strong watching brief on what's happening in the schools, and they don't accredit them. If any school of social work, whether it's MSW or the BSW level, and so I think the standards are coming along, and when the school doesn't get accredited. But that doesn't mean that that BSW person or MSW person can't join the association. If you have your degree, you are able to join your professional association. It's different in some province. Some people, some provinces, you're writing an exam to become a professional social worker. It's my personal opinion that social workers not only, like in New Brunswick, I worked very actively in my pioneer times to get an act of incorporation and to get an act of registration for social workers in New Brunswick. And, I am a registered social worker in this province, but there's no teeth in it. And I feel that social workers should be licensed, that we need a new act, and there's been a strong movement in New Brunswick in the past few years to have a licensing program whereby that the person you have seen, in fact, is not just a registered social worker, but a licensed one with credentials, has passed an exam, and has met the standards of professional social work standards. So that's pretty exciting, in my opinion, and I hope we'll go forward.
Another event that I believe occurred during the time that you were serving on the national executive was that I understand that some of the members of the executive were subject to a lawsuit.
Yes, that also was a pretty exciting time, and I guess it was pioneer in intent that I'm sure we learned a great deal from it. A member was excluded from membership, which is in any branch bylaws, and Constitution, same as it is at the national level. But it was at the national level at that time, because of the way the association was constructed nationally, that the membership was dropped. And this was very upsetting to the person who had lost his membership. And he sued, I believe, the board, or the board members that were involved in that decision, and there were 20 of us. They were sued for $2 million, and we thought, because we were board members of an incorporated body, that you were protected. But that's misinformation. If you serve in any community board, or in a matter whether you're incorporated or not, you are personally liable. So that went on. That suit was underway in Ontario, until the statute of limitation, 7 years, ended it. And I think it was resolved within the 7 years, and the suit was dropped because of some legal technicality. But in a sense, all the records of the material were sealed for 7 years. But it was, I think it taught us something. I think that was an interesting time, and I think any professional organization has to go through some bad times as well as the good, and it worked out okay in the end.
One of the other issues that I know that has been under consideration for some period of time, and I don't know whether it was during the time you were there, is the matter of professional ethics.
Yes, they have a new statement of the Code of Ethics out at the moment, and people are looking at it, and certain groups feel that it's an excellent paper. On the other hand, I know some people who don't agree with it, and it's so complete that I guess there's probably a little piece for everybody in it that would give you pause. And some of the issues that come out, that social workers have to dedicate themselves to the common good, so that in a time of crisis, social workers are supposed to come forward and be helpful. And some people feel that that's not always appropriate for some people. Taking a profession per se and say that, you must function under these circumstances raises some questions, I think, sometimes in people's minds. And, some social workers are arguing they're like, social work as a profession is supposed to work with all peoples and all race, color, and creed with no prejudice. And today, people are more outspoken, and people do have very specific views of what they're prepared to do. And I guess social work as a profession is like any other profession. We have nurses in hospitals that don't want to have anything to do with abortion programs and opt not to work at those times. And I guess hospitals are allowing them to do that. But they're saying, I believe in that Code of Ethics, that social workers probably shouldn't do that, that they should be free to follow through with their dedication to helping people. But I think times are changing, and I think most professions are accepting that social workers are humans, and they have some personal biases, and they just remove themselves from the bias by stating, in fact, that this is an area in which they don't feel it's appropriate for them to take action.
One of the other events that occurred, I believe, during the time that you were on the National Executive was the change in organizational structure of Canadian Association of Social Workers from a national association to a national federation. Were you at all involved in that change process?
Yes, it was a pretty painful kind of thing, but it came at the same time. It paralleled the growth of individuality in the provinces. In the same way as the provinces were becoming stronger politically, individually, as geographic political entities, and they were saying that, we want independence, we want to make all our own decisions about what's going on in our provinces. Associations were saying the same thing. They didn't, provinces wanted to run their own business, and they wanted to control their own admission to membership, at whether it's BSW or MSW level, or even lower than that in educational standards and experience. And it paralleled that movement right across the province, that sense of national identity within the provincial group. And I think the association has survived it and has become a federation of members. But having remembered the time when, as an individual member of the New Brunswick Association, I also knew clearly what was happening nationally through the Canadian Association of Social Workers, and I felt very much a part of both groups. You don't have that sensation now. You join your association. You only hear about what's going on nationally through the National Journal, the Social Worker, and through your representatives to that federation, if you happen to be at a meeting where they tell you about it, or through your own provincial news publication. We have a publication called The Dossier in New Brunswick, and you learn something then of the national things. But I have no doubt at all that the CASW is continuing to be a good spokesperson on behalf of professionals, and are working very hard.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a different structure, and you don't feel as close to it.
Mm-hmm. I wonder if we could take a break for just a second here. I want to ask a technical question. Turn it off for a second. I want to ask, again, a retrospective question. On the scale of things about the changes that you've seen over the years, from when you first got out of school in 1949 to what you see today, what are the significant changes that stand out in your mind?
Well, in social work?
That affect you in your job?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the major things has been the fact that, you know, when I trained, that, you know, the old thing, you wear brogue shoes and a felt hat, and you don't reach out to people like you're somebody that kind of sits there and absorbs and gives back. But the fact that you can get the recognition that we're people too, and that you can go into a home and share a cup of coffee and not somehow or rather ruin your relationship. You know, the whole, you know, what the 60s was all about, the flower children type of thing. They may have gone too far, but what they were really saying is that it's okay to have feelings, and let people know what they are. And that may have been just the perspective from that one school of social work I was in. I don't know. I doubt it. I think that most schools of social work in the 30s and 40s were pretty rigid.
Where the social worker was to be removed and somewhat distant from the client.
Yeah, that it was important to be distanced. That in some way, if you weren't at a distance, you couldn't help them. You know, they got a little different. My head, both my clothes are all scrunched up at this point.
And about other changes that you've seen over the years that strike you?
I think that one of the positive changes is the fact that there is an acceptance of social work as a profession, that it has status and an ethical component, and it's based on very firm concepts that work, and that you know, not every Joe Blow off the street becomes a social worker. That it's a combination of caring and being part of something, as well as being educated and so on, and that within that range of you know, personal feeling, you can adapt to. That there are some people who adapt better to certain kinds of jobs, and that people should recognize that. That social work isn't just, everybody can't do the same things, with the same kind of training even. So I think that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, so even the generic social worker would have types of work at which one would be better than another. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, yeah. And that people should recognize that there can be individual differences, and it's okay. You know, in the same way as all doctors aren't the same. They don't have the same bedside manner, and they don't have the same way of deciding what decision they're going to make in any given problem. Or a lawyer, it's the same kind of thing. Whereas in the early days, there was some feeling that you all had to look alike. Act alike, feel alike. That's not true.
Yeah. How about regrets, Carol?
I think sometimes I've wondered if it might have been exciting to get into different areas, like it would have been interesting to maybe work in a hospital for a while, or work in a family court. But that was one of my big community things that the University Women's Club actually did do. Their Corrections Association went into a big campaign to develop family courts, ahead of the National Commission on Family Courts and the local authorities, so that I think it would have been interesting to maybe even worked in family court for a while. I think there's a lot of things, or work in an institution for children, or any of these things, a group home for children. But I don't have any real regrets. I've been able to keep up with my own education by I've gone to the University of Michigan, and I've gone to Smith College, and I have gone to the University of Toronto, and at various times to upgrade myself, and I have kind of been, I've really enjoyed that, because I think something's happening all the time, and I've been able to keep, abreast of things.
Keep up, yeah.
That way.
If you were starting out again tomorrow and knew you had another 30, 40 years ahead of you to practice, what would be the need in the community or in New Brunswick at large that you think is most important for you to work on?
I guess probably as a community organizer, I'd like to work with helping the community start again to be responsible for itself. I think that people have sat back too long and expected government handouts, although you have to understand that I was one of the prime movers in trying to get government to intervene and give help to people, but not the way it happened, where everything came under government control. I don't think the individual sense of wanting to help people should have been destroyed by eliminating private agencies. So I think I'd like to be out there working with self-help groups and with people, the battered women themselves, dealing with their own problems, working with groups of children and their parents and helping them do the public relations work and the public education that has to be done to change what's going on in society today. We know there's a great deal of sexual abuse, and we know, and we're seeing it every day in my work, and I know in the lives of other social workers. There's been a great deal of incest, and I work today with a lot of people who have come through that 20 and 30 years ago, still affecting their lives. And I think that if we could get self-help groups and people in the community working through these things on their own with some professional component, that the solutions would be better in the long run. And it's costly to provide professional services like I've been involved with. I understand that. It costs still a great deal for me as a professional therapist. We run traveling clinics in the mental health clinic, and it costs a lot to send me to another town for a full day to work with a full caseload of people with problems. And that's just a drop in the bucket when I know in that community I should be spending my time organizing groups to help single parents. We have a lot of unmarried women raising children by themselves, and they're shut up long, long hours with the community not offering any support systems for them. They have social assistance, and their rent is paid, and they got food in their mouths, but they have few friends, they have no activities, they can't hire babysitters to babysit so they could go out. And I want to, and I think that I would work a great deal toward that kind of community organization, not the critical self-development type of thing where you stand back and yell at government because they're not doing it. I'd like to work again more closely with church group and organizations of men and women and all the normal volunteer people that I had to work with 30 years ago. In other words, I've come full circle. I'm back to where I was 30 years ago, wanting to help the community solve their own problems. Of course, mind you, I'm brainwashed. I really do believe community mental health programming works in the preventive sense. So I guess that's where I'd be at.
That's where you'd start, yeah. Carol, I wonder if in closing there's anything you'd like to add?
No, I just find that your program interesting. I think that there is something to be learned from the past for the present, and I think that having your organization look at some of the things that have happened in social work, because I'm not sure that social workers have had all the answers. They were, in some cases, including myself, we were too idealistic, and our suggestions were for solving problems, were too pat. They were too easy and sometimes superficial, and we didn't understand that, like when we were in favor of unemployment insurance payments, we didn't know that in effect a government service would begin to use that as a hedge against poverty, that it would become an insurance in that sense. And I hate to see the young people today having to accept, even though they have trades and they have college educations and they have careers that they could go into, having to rely on the unemployment insurance concept. Projects, work for 6 months, that kind of thing.
Mhm.
So I guess I'd do a few things differently.
Okay. Carol, I'd like to thank you very much for spending your time with us this afternoon. I found it very informative and very, very interesting.
Well, I've enjoyed it.
It's much appreciated. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Boy, I lost my voice.